Chapter 4. Beneath the Paris Moon. Paris wore its nighttime guise like a second skin, transforming as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streets of Montmartre shimmered under the pale moon, its narrow alleyways humming with the quiet pulse of the city's undercurrent. Cabarets, dens, and the hidden corners where whispered dealings thrive ambled through the open portal of the town. Étienne Morel navigated these streets with the practiced ease of someone who had spent too much time chasing the ghosts that lurked in the shadows. Tonight, those ghosts were closer than ever. The previous night's revelations at Valère clung to him like fog, refusing to dissipate. Augustine's words echoed in his mind. "Your brother's hand reaches further than you realize." It was not a warning Étienne could ignore. The streets led him deeper into Montmartre's heart, toward the cabaret Le Pignon Noir, an establishment notorious for attracting Paris's most enigmatic figures. It was said that behind its velvet curtains, alliances were forged and vendettas buried. If the faceless had informants among the city's elite, Le Pignon Noir was where they would gather. Étienne's coat flared slightly as he entered the cabaret's threshold, the heavy velvet curtains parting to reveal a room awash in dim red light. Smoke curled from the lips of finely dressed patrons who lounged across scattered tables, their laughter low and conspiratorial. At the center of the cabaret's stage, a woman in a feathered mask swayed to the haunting strains of a violin, her voice a sultry whisper that barely carried over the hum of conversation. Étienne's gaze swept the room until it settled on a familiar figure near the bar. Louis the Rat, a fixture of Paris's underbelly, a man whose loyalty was dictated by francs, not friendship. Louis's narrow eyes flicked toward Étienne the moment he approached, his thin lips twisting into a grin. "Morel," he greeted, swirling a glass of absinthe. "I thought you'd gone respectable. What brings you back to the gutter?" Étienne leaned against the bar beside him, signaling for a drink he wouldn't finish. "I'm looking for someone," Étienne said. Louis chuckled softly, taking a long sip. "Aren't we all?" Étienne's gaze sharpened. "The faceless." The smile vanished from Louis's face. His fingers drummed nervously against the rim of his glass. "Not a name we throw around lightly," Louis murmured, eyes flicking toward the corners of the room, as if expecting someone to be listening. Étienne leaned in, his voice low but edged with iron. "I know they're watching the city. I know they meet in places like this. I want to know who carries their messages." Louis hesitated, the flicker of uncertainty passing through his features. Étienne knew him well enough to recognize the calculation behind his eyes, the weighing of risk versus reward. 50 francs, Louis said finally, eyes narrowing. "They." Étienne retrieved a small pouch from his coat and placed it on the counter. Louis took it without counting. "Behind the stage," Louis whispered, tipping his glass in the direction of the performance. "The private lounge. Masked men come and go, but there's one who never leaves. They call him La Bête. If anyone knows how to find the faceless, it's him." Étienne's brow furrowed slightly. "What's his role?" Louis's grin returned, but it carried no warmth. "Gatekeeper. No one speaks to the society without passing through him." Étienne nodded, slipping away from the bar. Beyond the stage, the noise of the cabaret dimmed, replaced by the soft shuffle of footsteps along the narrow corridor that led toward private booths and lounges. Faint strains of music drifted behind the doors, but the farthest chamber, marked by a silver mask carved into the wood, stood silent. Étienne approached, hand brushing the revolver beneath his coat, though he refrained from drawing it. He knocked once. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with velvet drapes. A single figure reclined in an ornate chair near the hearth, his broad shoulders casting long shadows across the wall. His face, partially obscured by a dark mask that resembled the snarl of a beast, turned toward Étienne with measured curiosity. "You're not one of mine," the man rumbled, his voice deep and rough as gravel. Étienne stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. "No," Étienne replied calmly, "but I believe you have something I need." The masked figure's eyes narrowed beneath the wolfish snarl of his mask. "And what might that be?" "The names of those who serve the faceless." A low chuckle reverberated from the man's chest. "You don't ask for small things, detective." Étienne's stance did not waver. "I don't have time for small things," he said. The man studied him carefully, leaning forward in his chair. The firelight danced across his mask, illuminating the harsh lines carved into it. "I know who you are," he said finally, "the bloodhound of the Paris police, but there's one thing I don't understand." Étienne's brow arched. "What's that?" "You're chasing your own shadow." Étienne stiffened. "What do you mean?" Labette's gloved hand reached beneath the folds of his coat, producing a folded letter. He extended it toward Étienne without rising from his seat. "This arrived for me 3 days ago," the masked man said. "I thought it curious. Perhaps you will too." Étienne accepted the letter, his eyes scanning the seal before he carefully unfolded the parchment. His breath caught. The letter was written in the same hand as the invitations found on the victims. But this message was different. Étienne must not interfere. It bore no signature, only the mark of a white mask at the bottom of the page. Étienne's fingers tightened around the paper. "Who delivered this?" he demanded, voice sharp. Labette's eyes gleamed beneath the mask. "A man I'd never seen before, but I suspect he's closer to you than you think." Étienne's jaw tightened. "Étienne, Henri." Labette's head dipped slightly. "Perhaps. Or someone acting on his behalf. Either way, detective, your presence in this city has not gone unnoticed." Étienne folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his coat. "I need to find them," he said quietly. Labette chuckled once more, leaning back into the shadows. "Follow the trail of masks, detective," he murmured. "But be warned, you may not like the face you find beneath them." Étienne emerged from l'Épinoire into the cool embrace of the midnight streets. The cabaret's warmth and smoke dissipated as the door clicked shut behind him, leaving only the faint hum of revelry trailing into the alley. Moonlight pooled on the slick cobblestones, and the distant toll of a bell marked the hour. Clutching the letter from Labette, the Étienne let his thumb brush the embossed emblem of the white mask at the bottom of the page. Étienne must not interfere. Henri's hand, or perhaps another's, had penned those words. Either way, the message was clear. Étienne did not care for warnings. She was old, and she struggled to respond efficiently or inappropriately to an impurity he could scarcely stand. The path stretched before him like the veins of the city, branching in directions that promised no easy answers. His brother's return from the shadows brought more questions than solace, and now the faceless stood between him and the truth. His footsteps echoed softly along Rue Saint-Vincent as he descended into the heart of Montmartre. The neighborhood thrived after dark, street vendors packing their carts, lamps flickering in the upper windows of brothels and wine-houses. But Étienne's focus was singular, his destination clear: the catacombs. Labette's final words lingered: "Follow the trail of masks." Étienne had chased criminals across Paris for years, but the faceless did not operate like ordinary thieves or murderers. They cloaked their crimes in ritual, in symbolism. If they truly controlled the city's secrets, the catacombs Paris's oldest vault, would bear their mark. Étienne descended into the labyrinth through an entrance hidden behind a crumbling mausoleum near Place d'Enfer-et-Rochereau. He slipped past the rusted gate, careful not to draw the attention of the occasional sentry that guarded official access points. This path, however, was not sanctioned by the city. It was, as Grim Detail's Place de Verde, rumoured, though the uncertainty led to a worrying level of trust. Camille had insisted on joining him, but Étienne refused. The catacombs were no place for someone unfamiliar with their dangers. With each step, the narrow corridor closed around him. The walls, lined with skulls and femurs, stacked in neat arrangements, bore silent witness to centuries of forgotten lives. Étienne's lantern cast shadows that flickered unnaturally across the stone faces, giving them an eerie semblance of life. Étienne knew the way well. These tunnels had sheltered fugitives, smugglers and revolutionaries for generations, but tonight he sought something deeper. His footsteps slowed as he approached an arch marked by a faded crest. A mask crudely carved into the stone above the entrance. The symbol matched the invitation left with Guillaume Duvet's body. Étienne traced the emblem with his fingertips, feeling the uneven grooves beneath the mossy surface. The carving was recent. The carving was, he realized, too much like the mathematical figures of some greater truth in nature. Beyond the arch, the air grew heavier, laced with the faint scent of burning wax. Étienne lowered the lantern's wick, letting the flame shrink to avoid casting too much light. The corridor stretched ahead, opening into a chamber where faint murmurs drifted like echoes from the past. Étienne pressed against the stone wall, inching forward, and loved the sensation of being moved slowly forward. Through the narrow gap he glimpsed them. The faceless. A dozen figures stood in a circle, masked and draped in long cloaks. At the center of the gathering, a single candle burned atop a stone altar. A man in a silver mask, taller than the others, raised his hand. Etienne's breath slowed. Ennui. His brother's presence filled the room with quiet authority, though he spoke little. The faceless hung on his every gesture, heads bowed slightly, as if awaiting command. Étienne couldn't hear the words exchanged, but the reverence in their posture told him everything he needed. Henri was not merely a member, he was their leader. "I am Michel Agré, Signor Marie Attache," she said, blinking slightly. Étienne leaned closer. A loose stone beneath his boot shifted with a soft scrape against the floor. The murmurs stopped. The silver-masked figure lifted his head sharply, gaze narrowing toward the shadows where Étienne hid. Étienne slipped back, flattening himself against the wall as his pulse quickened. The faceless moved swiftly, two of them breaking from the circle to investigate. Étienne retreated down the corridor, extinguishing his lantern to avoid detection. He counted each step, mapping the tunnels in his mind. The catacombs were vast, but only a few exits remained viable if the faceless pursued him. He glanced over his shoulder. The soft glow of approaching torches illuminated the passage behind him. Étienne quickened his pace. A second path, narrower, hidden behind collapsed rubble, lay. He slipped inside, pressing his back against the stone. The two masked figures passed without slowing, their attention fixed deeper within the tunnel. Étienne exhaled quietly, waiting for their footsteps to fade. When the corridor fell silent once more, he emerged and followed the opposite path, winding toward the exit. The faint sliver of moonlight that greeted him at the end of the tunnel felt almost foreign after the weight of the catacombs. Étienne pulled himself over the ledge, brushing dust from his coat as he stepped onto the damp grass of the cemetery above. A figure waited by the mausoleum's entrance. Etienne's revolver was in his hand before he fully registered her face. "Camille," he muttered, lowering the weapon, "I told you to stay behind." Her eyes, wide and searching, flicked toward the dark moor of the catacombs entrance. "I grew tired of waiting," Etienne sighed, though a flicker of gratitude softened his irritation. "You shouldn't be here," he said, brushing past her toward the main road. Camille fell into step beside him. "Did you find them?" Etienne nodded grimly. "Henri leads them." Her footsteps slowed, but she did not falter. "Then you were right. Your brother is alive." "Yes." "But the man I saw down there—" His voice trailed off, the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the stone corridors he had just left behind. "He's not the same brother I remember." Chapter 5. The Ball of Masks. Part 1. The Invitation. Etienne stood at the window of his modest apartment, gazing out over the rooftops of Paris as dawn stretched its pale fingers across the city. The Seine shimmered faintly beneath the weak sunlight, while the spires of Notre Dame loomed in the distance, veiled by early morning mist. He hadn't slept, not since returning from the catacombs. The silver mask sat on his desk, its empty eyes reflecting the thin light that crept through the curtains. Camille Laurent sat nearby, wrapped in her dark coat, though she seemed far away, staring at nothing in particular. "Tell me what you saw," she murmured, her voice low, almost fragile. Etienne shifted his gaze to the mask, its polished surface catching the rising sun. "Henri commands them. Whatever this society is, whatever they believe, he's at its center." Camille turned slightly, the angle of her face revealing the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "And you're certain it was him?" Etienne's jaw tightened. "I knew the way he moved, the way he carried himself." He exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling deeper. "There's no doubt." Silence lingered between them, punctuated only by the distant clang of bells echoing over the river. Camille finally rose, pacing toward the far side of the room. "I can't pretend to understand the history between you," she said softly, "but we can't stop now. If your brother leads the Faceless, confronting him may be our only chance of finding out what happened to Alain." Etienne glanced toward her, recognizing the resolve that hardened her features. For all the grief she carried, Camille possessed a quiet strength that refused to bend. His gaze drifted back to the mask. "We'll find them again," he said quietly. At that moment there was a knock at the door. Etienne crossed the room swiftly, placing a hand against the revolver beneath his coat. He opened the door just wide enough to see a courier standing in the hallway, hat drawn low over his brow. Without speaking, the man handed over a black envelope, the wax seal marked with the symbol of the white mask. Etienne watched the courier retreat down the stairs without a backward glance. "You—" Camille stepped closer as he opened the envelope, revealing the elegant script within. "By moonrise, the grand stage awaits, the Opera Garnier." "Ah!" Etienne's eyes narrowed. "A masquerade." Camille leaned in to read over his shoulder. "It's a formal invitation." "It's more than that," Etienne replied, folding the letter carefully. "This is their summons." His fingers brushed the mask resting on the desk. "They want me to come." Camille's gaze flicked toward him. "Then we'll go." Etienne shook his head. "No, it's too dangerous." Camille's expression darkened. "If you think I'll stand by while you face them alone, you're mistaken." Etienne's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to argue. Camille's determination was unyielding. Gilles Brunet Hombridge Tifonil Blomans Frogman Conjo Theater Jean-Pré Camille Golfs Achmet. Fine, he relented, but you'll stay close. And if things go wrong, you leave immediately, no hesitation. Camille nodded, though Étienne suspected she would not abandon the pursuit so easily. The Opera Garnier awaited. The Opera Garnier stood like a jewelled monument beneath the evening sky, its gilded facade illuminated by gas lamps that flickered along the boulevard. Carriages lined the street, and masked figures emerged in pairs, their laughter drifting into the night as they ascended the grand staircase toward the entrance. Étienne stepped from the carriage, clad in a tailored black coat that swept just above his polished boots. A dark mask concealed the upper half of his face, its angular design casting sharp shadows over his cheekbones. Camille followed, draped in an elegant navy gown, her own mask adorned with subtle silver trim that shimmered beneath the gaslights. They joined the procession at the opera's entrance, the soft murmur of conversation echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. The foyer glittered with chandeliers and mirrored panels, reflecting the hundreds of guests that milled about in fine evening wear. Étienne's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces hidden beneath masks. Though identities were concealed, the weight of unseen gazes followed him as they crossed the marble floor. Camille slipped her arm through his, playing the part of a guest, though her grip betrayed a tension just beneath the surface. Lecoq suddenly stopped, as if frustrated by not being caught up. "Do you see him?" she whispered. The cacao sighed loudly in the distance. "Not yet," Étienne replied. "But he's here, somewhere." A masked attendant approached, bowing politely. "Your invitation, monsieur," he said. Cyberg was led by his thoughts. Étienne retrieved the black envelope and handed it over. The attendant examined the seal briefly before nodding. "The main performance will begin shortly," he said. "Until then, the ballroom is open to all guests." Étienne inclined his head, leading Camille toward the grand staircase. They ascended slowly, weaving through groups of masked patrons who whispered in quiet huddles along the railings. The ballroom stretched ahead, alive with a swirl of figures dancing beneath the glow of chandeliers. But beyond the revelry, Étienne felt the undercurrent of something else, something darker. At the far end of the room, a group of masked men stood apart from the others, their silver masks unmistakable beneath the dim light. Étienne's gaze locked on them, but none moved to acknowledge him. "Stay here," he murmured to Camille. Her grip tightened. "I said, I won't be far," he assured, gently prying her fingers from his arm. "Wait for me by the stairs." Camille hesitated, but nodded. Étienne crossed the ballroom, weaving through the dancing couples until he reached the far side. The masked figures near the wall remained still, their posture indifferent, as though they were part of the architecture. "Henri!" Étienne called softly. The central figure tilted his head slightly, but did not speak. Étienne's pulse quickened. "I know it's you." The masked man stepped forward, lifting his hand to remove the mask. As it slipped away, Étienne's breath caught. It was not Henri. The stranger smiled faintly. "Not tonight, detective." Étienne's hand drifted toward his revolver. "Lower your weapon," the man warned, voice calm but edged with steel. "You are among friends, after all." Étienne's eyes narrowed. "Friends don't hide behind masks." The man's gaze hardened. "And yet, here you stand, wearing one." Étienne said nothing, but his hand fell away from the revolver. The masked man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your brother will come when he is ready. But be careful, detective. There are more masks in Paris than faces." Étienne's gaze burned with unspoken questions, but the masked man withdrew into the crowd before he could demand answers. Camille appeared beside him moments later. "What happened?" she asked softly. Etienne's jaw tightened. "Henri wasn't here," he replied. But even as the music swelled around them, Etienne knew the game had only just begun. Etienne lingered near the fringes of the ballroom, his eyes tracing the masked figures that danced beneath the flickering chandeliers. Each step of the waltz seemed deliberate, the swish of fabric and tap of polished shoes creating a rhythm that felt too precise, like the ticking of an unseen clock, counting down to some inevitable conclusion. Camille stood by the grand staircase, a glass of champagne held lightly in her gloved hand. Her mask caught the light, silver filigree glinting as she surveyed the crowd. Though she sipped occasionally, her gaze rarely left Etienne, waiting for his signal. Etienne's focus, however, rested on the masked figure who had spoken to him only minutes before. The man had disappeared into the sea of guests as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. There are more masks in Paris than faces. Orin was unsure which prior material to back his point. Etienne had spent years navigating the underbelly of the city, peeling back layers of deception. But this was something else, something deeper. The Faceless were not merely a secret society. They were a force embedded within Paris's most powerful circles, woven into the very fabric of the city. The masked guests were not just revelers, they were pieces in a game, and Etienne had stepped onto the board without knowing the rules. "Oh!" A burst of laughter erupted from a nearby cluster of dancers, drawing his attention for a brief moment. When he looked back, Camille was gone. The stranger was sitting in the center of the dance floor, his hands on his knees. He glared at Cam and stole away toward the corner of the stage. Etienne's pulse quickened. He scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the swirling figures, but there was no sign of her by the stairs. He slipped between the couples on the dance floor, careful not to draw too much attention. Camille's absence unnerved him. She wouldn't have left willingly, not without alerting him first. Tension followed him all the way to the other side of the river, where hundreds of migrants hurried to dispatch envoys. Etienne ascended the staircase 2 steps at a time, crossing into the opera's upper galleries. The corridors were quieter here, the music below muffled by the heavy drapery that lined the walls. Gas lamps flickered at regular intervals, casting long shadows that stretched across the marble floor. Etienne's footsteps slowed as he moved past rows of empty opera boxes, each one dark save for the faint glimmer of stage lights below. He paused at the edge of the grand balcony, scanning the crowd beneath. From this vantage point, the ballroom stretched out like a stage, the guests little more than moving silhouettes beneath the chandeliers. Still no sign of Camille. Etienne's fingers brushed the handle of his revolver, the weight of it reassuring against his palm. A soft creak echoed from the corridor behind him. He turned sharply, footsteps light against the carpet as he moved toward the sound. A door stood ajar, candlelight spilling from the gap. Etienne slipped inside, his silhouette melting into the shadows. The room was small and sparsely furnished, likely an unused dressing chamber. A single candle burned on the vanity, its flickering light illuminating a glass of untouched wine. "Despite at the time I ask you where the Queen's account books may be," the carpenter said. And beside the glass, a mask. Etienne approached cautiously, lifting the mask from the table. Its design was familiar, an exact replica of the white mask he had found on Duvet's corpse weeks earlier. Etienne's thumb traced the edge of the porcelain, cold and smooth beneath his touch. Before he could place it down, a voice drifted from the far corner of the room. "Do you enjoy collecting relics of the dead?" Etienne turned swiftly, revolver half drawn. Camille emerged from the shadows, her mask still in place. Etienne exhaled, lowering his weapon. "You shouldn't wander off." Camille approached slowly, her gaze fixed on the mask in his hand. "I didn't wander," she replied. "I was led." Étienne's eyes narrowed. "By whom?" She hesitated, her expression unreadable behind the mask. "A man approached me by the staircase. He wore no mask, only a silver ring. He said you would find me here." Étienne's grip tightened around the mask. "And you followed him?" Camille's voice lowered. He knew Alain's name. Étienne's gaze darkened. Before he could respond, the candle's flame flickered violently, casting sudden, jagged shadows along the walls. The door creaked open slowly. Étienne stepped in front of Camille, his revolver raised. A figure stood in the doorway, his face obscured by a dark hood. Étienne's finger hovered over the trigger. "Identify yourself." The figure remained silent, lifting his hand to reveal a folded letter. Étienne lowered his weapon slightly, eyes fixed on the envelope. The man stepped forward, placing the letter on the table beside the wineglass. Without another word, he retreated into the corridor, vanishing before Étienne could pursue. Camille's breath trembled faintly behind him. Étienne unfolded the letter carefully. The script was familiar, ornate, deliberate. "You're closer than you realize, brother." Étienne's eyes burned as he scanned the signature at the bottom. He recognized the English Henri Morel. Camille's eyes met his as she read over his shoulder. "What does it mean?" Étienne set the letter down, his pulse steady but cold. "It means this isn't over." They left the opera shortly after midnight, the streets quiet beneath the pale glow of gas lamps. Étienne's thoughts churned as they crossed the boulevard, the mask from the dressing chamber now tucked beneath his coat. Camille walked beside him, silent but alert, as if expecting more shadows to emerge from the alleyways at any moment. As they reached Étienne's apartment, Camille finally spoke. "What happens now?" Étienne unlocked the door, stepping inside as he held it open for her. "Now," he said softly, "we wait for Henri to make his next move." Camille hesitated in the doorway, her gaze lingering on him. "And if he doesn't?" Étienne's eyes darkened as he placed the mask on his desk beside the letter. "He will," Étienne replied, his voice cold and certain. "Men like him always do." Chapter 6. The Catacombs Chase. The heavy rain pounded against the windows of Étienne's apartment, blurring the lights of Paris into distant smears of gold and silver. The mask from the opera lay on the desk, still as a corpse, yet its hollow eyes seemed to watch Étienne as he paced the room. Camille sat near the hearth, hands clasped tightly around a cup of untouched tea. It had been 3 days since the masquerade at the Opera Garnier. 3 days without another message, without a sign of Henri or the faceless. Étienne's patience was wearing thin. "This waiting," Camille finally said, breaking the silence. "It's a game to them." Étienne paused, glancing over his shoulder. "They want me to feel hunted." Camille set the cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "Then why not confront them? You know where to find them." Étienne shook his head, stepping toward the window. "The catacombs are too vast. The entrances are scattered across the city, and half of them collapse beneath the weight of time." Camille's eyes narrowed slightly. "But there's one entrance that isn't abandoned, isn't there?" she said. Étienne turned to her. She held his gaze, a subtle challenge in her expression. "The chapel. Saint-Pierre des Lombards." Étienne's lips pressed into a thin line. It was true. The chapel had offered him the closest encounter with the faceless, but entering their domain a second time would not come without risk. Camille rose, crossing the room until she stood just in front of him. "You're not the only one with something to lose, Étienne. I won't sit idle while the men who took my husband remain free." Étienne studied her carefully. Beneath the delicate mourning attire and soft words was a core of iron. Camille Laurent was not a woman accustomed to powerlessness. He nodded slowly. "If we do this, we go tonight." Camille's expression hardened with resolve. By the time they reached Saint-Pierre-des-Lombards, the rain had tapered into a soft drizzle that veiled the moonlight in a pale mist. The chapel stood shrouded in shadow, its decaying spire barely visible against the night sky. Étienne led Camille through the crumbling cemetery behind the church, his lantern casting faint pools of light across the moss-covered gravestones. A stone arch, half buried beneath ivy, marked the entrance to the catacombs. Étienne knelt, brushing aside the overgrowth to reveal a rusted iron gate. "This way," he whispered, pushing it open with a low groan of metal. Camille hesitated for only a moment before following him into the dark. The passage descended steeply, the air growing colder with each step. Étienne's lantern flickered as they moved deeper, the faint scent of damp earth curling around them. The walls narrowed, lined with neatly arranged skulls and bones that stretched endlessly in both directions. Étienne paused at a fork in the tunnel. To the left, the path led toward known catacomb routes frequented by smugglers and the occasional curious traveller. To the right, a mask was etched into the stone wall, nearly hidden beneath layers of grime. Étienne's breath stilled. He ran his fingers across the symbol, tracing the grooves carefully. "They've been here," he muttered. Camille's voice was soft. "How can you be sure?" Ent stepped back, allowing the lantern's glow to highlight the faint scratch marks beneath the carving. "Someone scraped the surface recently. This entrance isn't forgotten." Étienne stepped forward, his eyes smoling. He took the path to the right, leading Camille into the unknown. The corridor stretched onward for what felt like hours, the weight of the stones pressing down on them. Étienne's hand never strayed far from his revolver, his senses alert to every shifting shadow. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, a forgotten sanctuary carved beneath the city's streets. Pillars rose along the perimeter, draped in faded cloth, and candles flickered from niches cut into the walls. At the centre stood an altar, identical to the one Étienne had seen in Valais. But the chamber was empty. Yes? Étienne approached the altar cautiously, eyes scanning the edges of the room. The atmosphere felt heavy, suffocating. Camille stepped beside him, her gaze fixed on the empty pews. "They are not here." Étienne's fingers brushed the cold stone of the altar. "They were, recently." A faint sound echoed behind them. Footsteps, soft but deliberate. Étienne's heart pounded as he extinguished the lantern. "Get behind me," he whispered. Camille obeyed without question, retreating into the shadows. Étienne crouched, revolver drawn, as the footsteps grew louder. A faint glow appeared at the edge of the chamber, accompanied by two figures in dark cloaks. Their masks gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Étienne's grip tightened. He could take one, maybe two, but more would surely follow. The two figures stopped at the altar, one placing a folded letter atop the stone. Étienne watched as they lingered for only a moment before retreating down the opposite corridor. As the footsteps faded, Étienne approached the altar and unfolded the letter. "You search in the wrong places, brother. Follow the river, brother Orpha, or I shall burn brother Ocra. Ocra, it will sound like divine justice to do so." As his eyes narrowed, Étienne's eyes fell. Camille stepped beside him. "What does it mean?" Étienne tucked the letter into his coat. "The Seine. They're meeting near the river." Camille's breath quickened. "Tonight?" Étienne's gaze lingered on the fading candlelight. "Yes, tonight." The Seine stretched like a ribbon of molten silver beneath the moonlight, as Étienne and Camille approached its banks. The rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick with reflections of gas lamps that flickered along the waterfront. Étienne's coat billowed slightly as he scanned the river's edge, searching for signs of movement. A small dock jutted out into the water, and beneath it shadows shifted.
Étienne signaled for Camille to remain behind as he descended the stone steps leading toward the dock. His boots barely made a sound against the worn wood. A skiff bobbed gently against the pier, tethered by a frayed rope. At its bow sat another mask. Plain, unadorned. Étienne lifted it carefully, studying the faint symbol carved into its surface. A soft splash drew his attention. His eyes snapped toward the water as a figure emerged from beneath the dock. Cloaked and masked, the man approached without hesitation. There was no doubt in Ayok's mind as the world became. Étienne raised his revolver. "Stay where you are." The man ignored the warning, stepping closer. Étienne's finger tightened around the trigger. "Lower your weapon," the masked man said, his voice calm. "I am not your enemy." And his eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man hesitated for only a moment before lifting the mask. Beneath it, Henri Morel's face emerged. Older, colder, but unmistakably his brother. Étienne's breath caught. "Henri," he whispered.
Henri's gaze softened slightly. "It's been a long time, Étienne."
Étienne's hand trembled. "You left me to believe you were dead." Hendrins scowled at Étienne, who frowned back. Henri's eyes darkened. "I had to." Étienne's grip on the revolver loosened, but his heart pounded. Wait, what did I just study? Really? Like a sports ad? Henri's expression grew distant. "Because the faceless needed me." Étienne's revolver hung loosely at his side, but the weight in his chest grew heavier with each breath. The man standing before him was no phantom of grief or memory. Henri Morel, the brother he had mourned for 10 years, stood alive beneath the pale moonlight. Yet there was no warmth in Henri's eyes. Whatever bond once existed between them now felt like brittle glass, moments from fracturing.
"The faceless needed you," Étienne repeated, voice tight with disbelief. "Is that the justification you offer? Disappearing without a word? Letting me believe you were buried beneath this very city?"
Henri's gaze drifted toward the river, his expression unreadable. "You wouldn't have understood then. Try me." A faint breeze rippled the surface of the Seine, and the soft lap of water against the skiff punctuated the silence between them. Camille's silhouette lingered near the top of the stone steps, watching, but keeping her distance. Ha. Henri's hand rested on the edge of the dock, fingers brushing against the mask that had been left as a sign of their clandestine gathering. "The faceless exist because this city is rotting, Étienne. Paris parades itself in silk and gold, but beneath the surface lies decay, greed, corruption, betrayal. The men who claim to rule from the Palais Bourbon are no better than thieves in the alleyways." Étienne stepped forward, jaw tightening. "And murder is your solution?" Henri's eyes flicked back toward him, sharp as a blade. "Murder is their currency. I simply spend it more wisely." Étienne's grip on the revolver flexed. "Guillaume Duvier, the merchant on Rue de Rivoli. How many others?" "Or 4, is he.
Henri's lips pressed into a thin line. "Duvet profited off the misery of others. His name was among those responsible for our father's ruin. You of all people should know that justice is rarely found in the courts."
Étienne's heart hardened. Their father's death, driven to despair by powerful financiers who had destroyed his business, had nearly torn their family apart. But Étienne had buried that pain beneath years of service to the law, believing order would restore. what had been taken. Henri, it seemed, had chosen a different path. And Alain Laurent? Etienne demanded, gesturing toward Camille in the distance. Was he another offering to your vision of justice? Henri's eyes darkened. I didn't kill him. Itten took a step closer. But you know what happened. Peter catched his breath. For the first time, Henri's posture stiffened. His hand fell away from the mask, and his gaze shifted toward Camille.
Laurent was not innocent, Etienne. He involved himself in matters he didn't understand. The faithless watch carefully, but even we are not immune to betrayal. Someone else took his life. Someone inside our own circle. Etienne's pulse quickened. A traitor among the faceless?
Henri nodded. There are factions forming within. Some believe we should remain in the shadows, nudging the city toward reform quietly. Others wish to accelerate change by any means necessary. Etienne's breath slowed. And which side do you stand on? Henri's eyes softened just slightly. I still believe Paris can be saved, but I will not allow the city to become collateral in a war between power-hungry men. Etienne studied him for a long moment, the flicker of the younger brother he once knew flashing behind Henri's hardened gaze. But trust was a fragile thing, and 10 years had created a chasm between them that could not be crossed in a single conversation.
You can end this, Etienne said quietly. The faithless don't have to tear this city apart.
Henri's eyes narrowed. I no longer control all of them, Etienne. There are others pulling strings behind the curtain.
Etienne stepped forward, lowering his voice. Then let me help you.
Henri hesitated, the faintest crack in his stern facade. You walk a dangerous line, brother.
Etienne met his gaze, unflinching. So do you.
Henri studied him for a long moment, then reached into the folds of his cloak, producing a folded envelope sealed with wax. He placed it carefully into Etienne's hand.
Tomorrow night, Henri said quietly, the masquerade at the Palais Royal, a gathering of those who claim to guide the city's future. This invitation will grant you entry.
Etienne's fingers tightened around the envelope. What will I find there? Henri's gaze flickered toward Camille once more. The truth about Alain Laurent. Etienne's breath caught faintly, but he gave no sign of surprise. Henri took a step back, slipping the mask over his face once more. Before Etienne could respond, Henri turned and disappeared into the shadows along the riverbank.
Camille approached quietly as Etienne tucked the invitation into his coat. Her expression was calm, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Hi, listen close.
What did he say? She asked softly. Etienne hesitated, glancing toward the rippling surface of the Seine. Tomorrow night, he replied. The Palais Royal. Your husband's killer will be there. Camille's eyes darkened, her grip tightening around the edges of her cloak. Then we're going.
Etienne nodded, though unease gnawed at the edges of his resolve.
Henri had given him a chance, a rare window into the inner workings of the faceless. But Etienne knew that invitations of this kind always came at a price. And in Paris, debts were paid in blood.